Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and it's been a while. I haven't made a video since February of 2024, but I'm back here today to wrap up all the Pynchon I've been reading over the past year and a half. So, for those of you who have followed the channel, you know that I was going on a quote unquote Project Pynchon, a self given mission to read all of Thomas Pynchon's novels in chronological order from start to finish. The last time I left off with Pynchon, even though I did mention one book in my best books of 2024 list, Mason Dixon, but the last official episode of Project Pynchon I did was on Vineland, a video that got pretty much no views when I posted it, but then with the release of One Battle After Another, specifically the trailers, gained some more traction, people telling me how wrong I was, even though they had yet to read the book or see the movie. But I'm here today to talk about all the Pynchon I've been reading, which includes 4 Pynchon novels, and if you're considering the length of 2 of them, it's probably like 6 to 8 normal novels. So this will be a very informal video. I just want to wrap up what I've been reading, and the last time I made a Project Pynchon video was when his last novel was Bleeding Edge, but since then he has released a new novel in October, I believe, which I have right here. The Shadow Ticket, and something that I'll be probably reviewing separately as the final episode of Project Pynchon. But here we are. We're going to talk about all the Pynchon books I've read lately. But before we discuss Pynchon, I want to do a quick plug of my Substack. I've been very absent this past year on YouTube, but that's been the opposite of the case. On Substack, I am posting usually 3 articles a month on topics like Dadaism and Exile's Return. I do monthly recaps of the movies, books, and shows and podcasts that I enjoy, and I try to, branch out my horizons there. I talk a lot recently about Thomas Pynchon, actually, of all people. I have a video on Pynchon's influence of modern cinema. I talk not just about One Battle After Another, but a whole bunch of movies of that nature that I think have a Pynchonian sting to them that I think are directly inspired by Thomas Pynchon. It's an article that I'm very proud of, and I'll link it in the description below to check out. And I hope that if you like it, maybe you'll subscribe to my Substack as well, because I do book reviews there, I do book hauls, I just talk about art and cinema and writing and everything like that there. So I'm way more active there. So if you like my content, please subscribe to my Substack. And so let's get into the video. So I read Mason and Dixon, not in the summer of 2025, but in the summer of 2024. I read it at a time when I really wasn't sure if I wanted to keep doing this YouTube channel. I kind of lost a lot of interest in working on it, to be honest. And Mason and Dixon is a novel that came after Vineland. It is sort of a return to form for Pynchon, mainly in the gigantic size of the novel. People who have read Gravity's Rainbow know that he likes to write larger novels, whereas Vineland is more of a traditionally sized novel. Mason Dixon returns back to that epic length. And he'd been researching this novel for, I think, over a decade. He rumored to have traveled to England to study at the libraries there. And it shows in this book. Mason Dixon follows the titular Mason Dixon. They are 18th century surveyors who are known for making maps of the United States in its earliest form. They meet in the Caribbean, they meet in St. Helena, and the novel tracks their, the first time they meet up, their friendship over the years, the famous historical characters they meet along the way. And I would probably best describe Mason and Dixon as a mythologized, anti-mythologized story of the birth of the United States as we know it today. Written in 18th century prose, though also feeling distinctly Pynchonian with its plot and with its characters, Mason and Dixon, by many literary scholars, is considered to be his best novel. I know Gravity's Rainbow is his most well-known novel, but many people who have read Mason Dixon consider it to be his very best. As for me, of course, I'm kind of drawing on memories from a year and a half ago, but I think my biggest flaw with the novel is in my own approach to it. I think I attacked it too hard, to be honest, because I saw the length and I really wanted to read it and finish it, and I think I read it too quickly. It's a book that when I was going over my notes for this video, I was rereading sections, and I'm like, that section's really good. That's a really good quote. That really makes me think about, the history of the U.S. and how my views of it, based on what I learned in elementary school, are likely incredibly flawed. It's a book that, out of all of the Pynchon books I've read so far, is the one I am most eager to return to, because I think on a reread, it could be my favorite Pynchon book. Currently, my number one is The Crying of Lot 49. The same thing happened to me with Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, where the first time I read it, I could not get over the type of prose that it was going for. And then when I reread it, I absolutely adored it. And even though I like Mason Dixon way more than Wolf Hall on a first read, I think with the familiarity of the prose, now with more familiarity of Pynchon, because I read 3 more of his novels since Mason and Dixon, it's a book that I could see skyrocketing to the very top of my Pynchon rankings. That being said, Mason Dixon is an excellent novel, and one that I have remembered since the year and a half that I read it. Mason is more of like your Pynchon type character. He's quiet, he kind of whimsical, kind of laid back, kind of, slothish, like Tyrone Slothrop, kind of just drifts through life. He is distinct from his other characters in the fact that he was married. The real life Mason was married. His wife died young, and he kind of tying into like the magical realism aspects of this book. He does have several scenes where he talks to his wife from beyond the grave. Magical realism and like the mythologization of pre-Revolutionary War United States and pre-colonized United States is prevalent throughout the novel. There's this overwhelming feeling that the founding fathers are depleting the magic of the United States and turning it into like the overly capitalized, kind of dour, kind of flavorless cities that we see in, for example, San Narciso, that are just run by these entrepreneurs, philanthropists, capitalists that are wringing locations dry of culture and of identity for the sake of the dollar. Dixon, on the other hand, is a little bit more reactive to what's going on. He sees the injustices of, for example, slavery, and at one point in the novel, he lashes out against the slave owner. He's more, vocally furious against injustices that he sees. And so the two form a friendship, but like friends, they fight. But like friends, they joke, and like friends, they have a growing relationship, and it's all captured so wonderfully throughout the novel. Though both characters go through a ton of growth throughout the novel, it's really, by the end, feels like it's more Mason's story than Dixon's. As I said earlier, Mason feels more like a Pynchon character, and he's the one with who goes through the more severe character growth with the way he views the uncharted territory that is the U.S. at the time. His growing disillusionment and the decay of spirituality within his setting is tracked mostly through the conversations I mentioned earlier with his deceased wife, Rebecca. Earlier on in the book, when he has these conversations, she feels as real as, the physical form of herself. But as the novel goes along, she slowly starts to fade. And I'll read one of those passages right now. Rebecca, her eyelids never blinking, for where all is dust, dust shall be no more, confronts him upon surfaces not so much random as outlaw, uncontrolled by any apparent end of purpose. In the penumbra of God's concern, that's if you don't mind comparing his regard with a solar eclipse, moving water, Mason tries to go fishing whenever he can, for there is no telling what the next rifle may present him. The rock abysses, the mountainsides, leaves in the wind announcing a storm, shadows of wrought ironwork upon a wall, the kissing crusts of new-baked loaves. On the Indian warrior paths to and from, triumphs, captivities, and death, in the lanes of overgrown, of abandoned villages at the turn of the day, in the rusted ending of the sky's light. In the full eyes of the wind, she stands, waiting to speak to him. What more has she to say? He has long run out of replies. Then I am not she, but a representation. This thing, she will not style it, death. I am detained here, in this thing, that my body all the while has capable of and leading me to, and carried with it, surely, as the other thing, the thing our bodies could do together. She will not style it. Love. Has she forgotten words, over there where tongues are stilled, and no need for either exists. As I mentioned earlier, the main spearheading factor of the despiritualization of the United States is the spiritual ideals of the European colonizers who are coming into this land. We do meet George Washington and several other major figures, and even lesser known figures of this pre-revolutionary war time. Pynchon's greatest strength as a writer to me is his ability to shed light on historical events that are glossed over in your high school history textbook. We do meet George Washington, and he only is able to see three people through their religious ideals. That's how he categorizes everyone. And Pynchon, throughout the novel, damns basically like the oppressive Christianization of the United States, both by the original colonizers and by the United States government's own westward expansion. And I'm going to read one of those sections here. The wolf Jesus, as he is known in his native land, though I had the misfortune to meet him in my own. He has his training directly from those who persecuted Molinos and his followers. He is accordingly sworn to destroy all who seek God without passing through the toll gate of Jesus. The Molinistas, as do certain Buddhists of my own land, believed that the most direct way to the deity was to sit quietly. If this meant using Jesus as but a stage on a journey, or even passing by him, why, so be it. Buddhists speak of finding it necessary, if the Buddha be blocking one's way, to kill him. Jesuits do not like to hear this sort of thing, of course. It puts far too much into question. If access to God need not be by way of Jesus, what is to become of the Jesuits? In the sheer amount of silence required, do you think they could ever abide that? As we'll see through many other examples in the next three books I'm going to talk about, Pynchon does not seem like an atheist to me. He seems like someone who does believe in a higher power, but he just completely condemns the idea of restricting that higher power to one set of ideals, to one set of principles, to one name. And so, as we'll see again and again today, as we explore more Eastern religions, and also in Bleeding Edge, we get glimpses of an older Guatemalan religion. The ideas are the same, it's just the names change. But for some people, especially those in power, they can't handle the idea of the names being different, and so they will force their will upon other people through any means, especially violent means, possible. But Mason and Dixon isn't all doom and gloom. This is ultimately a really almost fantasy-like adventure, but there's also a ton of Pynchonian humor as well. Overall, Mason Dixon is a book that I cannot wait to go back to. I could even conceivably see myself rereading it within the next few years, because, as I said, as I'm going through the text again, more than any other Pynchon novel so far, I am just really, really impressed by what was accomplished. And I think having the broader idea of what he's going for will definitely improve the novel, especially taking my time as well and being able to get over that hump of the 18th century prose with the Pynchon style. I think it's going to be easily top 3 by a reread. Next up, I have a book that I did in fact read this year over the summer, that is Against the Day, which even for Thomas Pynchon standards is quite a task to take on. Against the Day followed up Mason and Dixon. Like Mason and Dixon, like Gravity's Rainbow, it is an epic novel. I believe Leaf by Leaf calls it an encyclopedia novel because it is a book that has many characters, many protagonists going across many different countries, exploring many different themes, and also many different, although not as severe as, say, the Recognitions, it does cross quite a few years as well in its timeline from start to finish. And even for Pynchon standards, it crosses dimensions at times as well, blending its own fiction and its own reality together. Despite its length, I would actually consider Against the Day to be one of the more accessible Thomas Pynchon novels if you can just take your time with it and not be overwhelmed by its sheer size. From a prose perspective, it's one of his easier ones to grasp while also capturing that biting satire that Pynchon is known for. I would say, at least from my readings pre-Shadow Ticket, Against the Day feels like the last Pynchon novel. And I should say The first 3/4 of Against the Day feels like the last Pynchon novel. Like Gravity's Rainbow, we are building up to cataclysm, whereas with Gravity's Rainbow, we are on our way to the nuclear bomb. With Against the Day, we are on our way to World War I, the first global war to, completely wrap up a lot of countries in what it will ultimately be senseless violence. And like with Mason and Dixon, we do get some major historical characters that show up. Franz Ferdinand shows up in the earlier chapters of the book. It starts out in Chicago during the time of the World's Fair, in which we get an exploration of class conflicts. And Franz Ferdinand is not painted very well in this book. In fact, he comes here with his rifle with the intent of hunting poor Hungarians, and just thinks nothing of it, thinks it's a totally normal thing to do. The novel starts off following Webb Travers, who is a mine worker and unionist, and also an anarchist. And throughout the novel, we get explorations of the meaning of anarchism and the meaning of social justice, the meaning of workers' rights. Because to someone like Scarsdale Vibe, who is the main antagonist of the novel, he is a rich, wealthy, white, Christian idealizing, Confederate idealizing man, patriarch coming from old money, and he views Webb as being an anarchist, and he's the one who ultimately hires killers to go after him. Webb is of such selfish nature that when he realizes that Tesla is creating electricity, his first thing on his mind is the injustice of not being able to charge people for electricity. His first thought is like, why would we give this away for free when we could actually make a profit off of this? So truly a despicable human being. But Webb Travers, the patriarch of the Travers family, in kind of like this old-fashioned Western family from Colorado, he dies early on in the novel. He's killed by 2 assassins, and from there the novel spans out to following his children, who all go on their own unique paths. The main character, I would say, of the Travers family is Kit, who's this brilliant engineer, and he is paid by Scarsdale to go abroad to Europe to study his craft in order to come back and, work for Scarsdale eventually. But Kit will eventually break away from that pact and form a life of his own. There's also Frank, who is the oldest of the Travers family and the one most sought on revenge against the assassins. He has this whole journey in Mexico that really feels like a classic Western novel. There's Lake, who forms an interesting relationship with the 2 assassins of her father. And there's also the youngest brother, Reef, who, in addition to, kind of like Mason in the last novel, sees a ghost version of his father follow him and develops a worship towards dynamite, which was what because as a miner, Webb's main weapon of resisting corporate oppression was dynamite, and he starts to worship dynamite. It recalls Enzian in Gravity's Rainbow, who while working on the bomb, he and his group of scientists turn to this cult-like worshiping of the bomb. So, and again, it's just it's a metaphor for the worshiping of death, which many people in all of Pynchon's fiction worship the demise of themselves and worship the demise of humanity. In this novel, we get the perspective of many people, again, from many different countries, from many different walks of life, and even from different dimensions as well. One of the more interesting characters is Detective Lou from Chicago, and again, Pynchon's descriptions throughout the novel are great. He really has a great understanding for setting, but Chicago feels the most well-realized. But across from all of these characters is the influence of propaganda. Especially in the United States, there is like this distaste for the poor, a distaste for the working class that is no doubt influenced by people like Scarsdale Vibe. So even a character like this detective, who is generally a nice person, he has really weird thoughts about the working class and the means they must go through to be noticed in an effort to have more rights. Lou's boss, Nate Privet, is probably one of the most susceptible to this propaganda, and he has very interesting thoughts on the plight of the working class and the means people like web travelers have to go to be noticed. And I'll read one of the sections as followed from Lou's perspective, observing his new boss. Nate Privet, everybody else at the WCI, needless to say, most of the agency's clients, none had too good of a word to say about the labor unions, let alone anarchists of any stripe. That's if they even saw a difference. There was a kind of general assumption around the shop that laboring men and women were all more or less evil, surely misguided, and not even quite American, maybe not quite human. But here was this hall full of Americans, no question, even the foreign-born. If you thought about where they had come from and what they must have been hoping to find over here and so forth. In fact, give them a good night's sleep and a square meal or two, and even a veteran detective would have a hard time telling difference from regular Americans. Yet, here they are expressing the most subversive thoughts, as ordinary folks might discuss crops, or last night's ball game. So Lou is has like a passive, it's not even like a conscious bias, but it's more of like a passive bias just through living in this world run by rich men, that of this disdain or like this looking down upon the working class people, this disgust for labor unions, even though they're trying to make lives better for workers. And so just the way, in different shades, again, Nate Privet, Lou's boss, is more extreme, but Lou and just the general American here has these thoughts without even realizing, how absurd they are. And just to read one more section from Against the Day, drawing the heaviest parallel to Mason and Dixon, the idea of how our government and how has influenced our history, how even to this day, hundreds of years later, how our revolutionary beginnings have been romanticized. It's just, again, Pynchon's brilliance and his ability to show us different sides of the United States and really just dunk on like our elementary school textbooks, and especially in how the story of the revolution is told, the means of it, and this discussion that Kit has with another character. Kit is obviously a brilliant engineer, but he's not really thinking too deep about the history of his own country. And here, I think he just represents most Americans, myself included, and especially at a younger age, of his idea of America's origin versus the United States' origin versus the reality of it. What? There's no state religion in the USA, partner. We've got freedom of worship. It's guaranteed in the Constitution. Keeps church and state separate. Just so as we don't turn into something like England and keep marching off into the brush with bagpipes and Gatling guns, looking for more infidels to wipe out. Nothing personal, of course. The Cherokee, replied Prance. The Apache, the massacre of Sioux ghost dancers at Wounded Knee. Every native Red Indian we found, you people have either tried to convert to Christianity or you've simply killed. That was about the land, said Kit. I suggested it was about the fear of medicine men and the strange practices, dancing and drug taking, that allow humans to be in touch with the powerful gods hiding in the landscape, with no need for any official church to mediate it for them. The only drug you've ever been comfortable with is alcohol, so you went in and poisoned the tribes with that. Your whole history in America has been one long religious war, secret crusades disguised under false names. You tried to exterminate African shamanism by kidnapping half the continent into slavery, giving them Christian names and shoving your peculiar version of the Bible down their throats. And look what happened. The Civil War? That was economics, politics. That was the gods you tried to destroy, waiting their hour, taking their revenge. You people really just believe everything you're taught, don't you? I will say, I did love Against the Day. In fact, it'll most likely be in my top 3 books of 2025. But what separates Against the Day from a book like Mason Dixon or Crying on Plot 49 or Gravity's Rainbow is the last quarter of the book. As I was alluding to, it very much seems like it's turning on the same path as Gravity's Rainbow of complete destruction. But whereas Gravity's Rainbow like ends in this total sense of of despair and uncertainty. Pynchon definitely loses his bite post Gravity's Rainbow, and here he ends Against the Day with a more traditional, happy-ish ending. There's a menage a trois that goes on towards the end that I think Pynchon finds hilarious, but it really just became, not that I am conservative in any way towards this kind of stuff, but just because there was like this weird spiritual and man-made cataclysm that was coming, and then it just kind of diverts into something that's totally irrelevant and not terribly interesting, and it doesn't really end with the same punch as Gravity's Rainbow. In fact, within the last 200 pages or so, I stopped highlighting anything. It really just ended on a good note, but not the note that it could have, considering Pynchon's ability to end books, especially in his younger career, with such a sucker punch. But that said, Against the Day is totally worth its time investment. It's a book that I would highly recommend, especially if you're new to Pynchon, because I do think, at least from a prose standpoint, it's one of his more approachable novels. And finally, we have the last two books, which I don't think I'll talk about for very long. Inherent Vice is a detective novel featuring protagonist Doc Sportello, who is this hippie stoner in Reagan-era California. It's the only book I don't have a physical copy of that I'm going to discuss today, and it's because I got rid of the book the day after I finished it. Inherent Vice is not a bad book by any means. In fact, when you look at all of the crime fiction writers, it might rank among the best if it was a work published by any of them. But for Pynchon, it is one of the most disappointing books I've ever read. One of the most indifferent reading experience I've ever had, and by far the least interesting and worst of Pynchon's books that I've read. I don't have terribly a lot to say about it other than Pynchon to me is at his worst when he's doing stand-up. I love his quick jokes, his 1-2 shot jokes, but when he drags jokes out, I think of the Blood and Vato stuff and Vineland, which people were like, oh, it's a reference to Cheech and Chong. I don't care what it's a reference of, I still think it's bad. Here, it feels like the whole book is just stand-up, and stand-up that bombs for me, stand-up that if I attended, I probably would not have chuckled once. Again, it's not a terrible book, but just for Pynchon, it just doesn't hit where it should, and it had no lasting impact on me. I was happy to finish it when I did. It even reflects in the movie that it was based off of as well. Inherent Vice, out of all of PCA's movies that I've seen, is his least interesting, and I'm shocked that as a Pynchon fan, that's the first book he decides to adapt. I don't know, maybe he sees something that I don't, but for me, Inherent Vice was a book that I was happy to be done with because it did nothing for me, and if I ever do reread Pynchon, which I will at some point in my life, Inherent Vice is all the way at the bottom of that list. Which then leads me to Pynchon's last book. Well, it was his last book and when I originally started the series, that being right here, Bleeding Edge, again, another sort of crime fiction novel, this one set in 2001, leading up to and in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. It stars, for the first time since The Crying of Lot 49, solely a female protagonist, that being Maxine, who is a fraud investor. She's looking into this tech entrepreneur, Gabriel Ice, and it leads her down a rabbit hole of CIA agents and videos of weapons testings that coincide a little too heavily with the actual 9/11 attack. Like The Crying of Lot 49, Pynchon is really good at writing female protagonists, in my opinion. He gets a lot of flack, and I do believe it's necessary flack for his female side characters, because a lot of them, and even though he does address the sexualization in kind of like a tongue-in-cheek way, at times they aren't as interesting as his male characters, his male side characters, and especially in Inherent Vice, like every female character is sexualized for no reason, and it's so agonizing. It's a little bit better in Gravity's Rainbow and in his other books, but here we have Maxine. He's not as good as Oedipumas in The Crying of Lot 49, but generally, I literally just finished this book today, and it is better than Inherent Vice. I did like the book, but like Inherent Vice, it's going to be at the bottom of the list of books that I'm going to be in a rush to reread, if I was being completely honest with myself. I came across an article recently, actually on the Thomas Pynchon subreddit, of famous like postmodernist writers and their last published books, like later in life postmodernist writers. And they talk about William Gaddis's last book and how it's about this lack of unfulfillment that he has, where it's a shorter novel, but it's all about him realizing he's not going to have the time to write all the books that he wants to write. After reading Inherent Vice and Bleeding Edge, I get the feeling that Pynchon is completely happy with his caseload. I don't get the feeling that he wants to write a book like Gravity's Rainbow ever again, be up for that kind of challenge. He seems like he's happy with his career and just wants to write books that indulge him, which is totally fine. He's earned it. Gravity's Rainbow and his earlier work are books you can reread infinitely and always get something new out of. And so I'm fine with that, but there is definitely this feeling of complacency in Inherent Vice and in Bleeding Edge that do make it frustrating to read, because you know what Pynchon can do at his very best, and these two books definitely are not it. That said, I did find more biting commentary in Bleeding Edge than I did in Inherent Vice. Drawing back to The Crying of Lot 49, Pynchon's world building is exceptional here. I just love when he has a character walking the street and just experiencing life in all of its dire nature. Like with Inherent Vice as well, there's this idea that the people on top, the wealthy elite on top, are destroying the world, and there's not really a whole lot we can do about it. And that sort of dire nature is compelling in itself, because that's what makes our protagonist feel human. Drawing comparisons to Against the Day, there are like rich elitist characters who travel to another country for nefarious means, but then get caught up in the culture and start believing in like their own religious beliefs and get obsessed with them. You see that with one of Scarsdale's children when he goes to the Icelandic bar and another country. I think he goes to Africa for a while, and when he comes back, he's lost his mind basically. And you get that here. During her research, Maxine gets caught up with a CIA agent named Windust, who has a very sketchy past. He's described as like a neoliberal and someone who would just do whatever he can to rise up the ranks. And one of his earlier missions, while he was still somewhat of a morally decent character, is in Guatemala, and he becomes obsessed with their depiction of hell. And so, drawing back to what the character said in Against the Day about Western Christianity at war with different smaller types of religions, and all those smaller religions and spiritualities waiting for their chance for revenge. This feels like them getting their revenge, granted in a small way, but it shows that they have survived in some meaningful way and that they are getting their revenge in some sort of way. By far, at least from a setting standpoint, Pynchon's most modern book that he's written, Shadow Ticket, takes place in an historically earlier stage. Whereas I love the onslaught of references, and it feels like the references have meaning, and the Pynchon's quirky style has meaning in his earlier novels. Here, it does feel like he's name dropping for the sake of reference and for the sake of doing his shtick. There's references to GIFs, there's references to first-person shooters, Hideo Kojima, and it doesn't really have the impact that his earlier books have. It does feel, again, kind of gimmicky more than anything else. And even though I still did enjoy it more than Inherent Vice, the shtick wears off when you're not feeling like you're getting the substance out of it. And in these two books, I didn't feel the substance as much. But with that said, Bleeding Edge is still a book that I would recommend to Pynchon fans. I don't really recommend Inherent Vice, but Bleeding Edge is still ultimately an enjoyable time. And because Pynchon's been a father by this point, there's a lot of just really kind of fun, smaller moments where Maxine's with her family. She has two sons and a divorced husband who's still part of the family and still trying to like potentially get back into the family, named Horst. And like their interactions are all really fun. And there's a really compelling and quiet scene towards the end where Maxine talks to her father, and her father is very politically active like Maxine. They don't try to hide themselves away from the actual brutality of the world. And she asks him, like, how do you come to terms with like slowly telling your kids that the world isn't as nice as it seems. And they have a really interesting interaction there that I thought was quite compelling and something that I might return to if I'm ever a father someday. And so, with that said, that is the conclusion of my Pynchon wrap up. I hope you enjoyed it. I do have a Substack which I write on way more frequently than I post videos here, and I do have a Pynchon related article where I talk about Thomas Pynchon's influence on cinema. Generally, post COVID and on, because I do see his style becoming more prevalent. And I'm not just talking about One Battle After Another. I'm talking about other movies that do sort of take that sort of chaotic, political, quote unquote, apolitical. I know I hate that word. Apolitical message to them. And so I would encourage you to check it out. I would encourage you to subscribe to my Substack as well. Everything on my page is free to read. And so I hope you do that. And I hope that you continue watching my videos and check out my Substack as well and read that article, because I am very proud of that article. So thank you, and I will see you next time, most likely for a Best Books of 2025 video. Thank you if you made it this far, and goodbye.